Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here to pay tribute to one of the greatest legends in the sport of boxing that we lost today at the age of 76, and that is George Foreman. Um, George Foreman, of course, one of the most famous boxers in boxing history, was born in 1949 in Marshall, Texas. Originally, he was during his youth, he lacked focus. He came from a very poor family in that part of Texas, so poor that uh, kids would tease him, "You're not George Foreman, you're George Poor Man," and make fun of him. But he was a big kid, so he decides to go down to to Job Corps, and it's in Job Corps. He's getting into a lot of fights. He's beating people up because he has a hell of a temper. And it's in Job Corps that they teach him how to channel that aggression into becoming a boxer. So he learns to box, and in 1968, he goes to the Olympics, where he defeats the Russian fighter. He actually boxes against the Soviet Union, the fighter from the Soviet Union. This was a famous Olympics because this was the Olympics that was the Black Power Olympics. Everything around the United States was changing. It was 1968. People were becoming more politically aware. So at the Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised the Black Power fist, and they declare their protest for the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, which became particularly brutal with the Tet Offensive, in where the United States attacked the Vietnamese on the Vietnamese New Year of Tet. But George Foreman is not that. George Foreman is not a black militant. He is an all-American boy. He wants to craft his public image, and the fight that he has in the Olympics against this Soviet fighter in a similar way to to Joe Louis and Max Schmeling in 1938, where he's African American, obviously, but he wants to represent all Americans. He comes out with an American flag, and he's uber patriotic. But this period of time, the 1960s, the mood of the country is not about that. The mood of the country is rebellion. The mood of the country is black power. The mood of the country is political awakening. The mood of the country is not a conservative. It's not a conservative mood for the country. Yeah, like I said, definitely. Um, it's not a conservative mood for the country. It is a radical mood. You had Muhammad Ali is out of boxing. He was suspended from boxing because of his refusal to serve in the Vietnam War. So they're not looking. The world is not looking for a Joe Louis type. The world is looking for a rebel, to represent them, especially the black population. You're going to the Olympics, and other black athletes are raising their black fist, in protest and rebellion, and you're here waving an American flag. It just really didn't resonate with a lot of people. So he comes home, and he doesn't really come home to a hero's welcome. But despite that, he starts his career in 1969 in Madison Square Garden. And he has an impressive career, remains undefeated. And then he goes up against Joe Frazier in 1972. Joe Frazier now is the champion, but he is disputed because he never beat Ali. Ali was suspended from boxing and he was stripped of the title. Frazier never beat him. So people are saying, well, Frazier, he's not the real champion. But anyway, Foreman makes quick work of Frazier and wins the title in 72. By 1974, the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire. Zaire was, yeah, yeah, David. Zaire was a country, it was sports washing. It was the equivalent of what Saudi Arabia does today when they have these big fights or they have these big WWE events, right? Like when they had um, that fight between uh, Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou. Well, Zaire was doing that back then in the 70s. This dictator, Mobutu, was brutalizing his people, and he wanted to take attention away from that. So he brought it to the fight. And it was Ali, who many people considered the real champion, against this beast, George Foreman. And George Foreman was a beast. He was like the youngest heavyweight champion of the world at that time. You know what I mean? So, and Ali, he had ring rust. He had one fight with Frazier, but that was about it since he was out of his suspension. So people were uh, really fearful for Ali. But much like the response to Foreman in America, after the Olympics, it was the same way in Africa. People loved Ali. People chanted Ali Boombaye, which is in the Zairean language. Um, it meant "Let's go, Ali." And what happens in the fight? Basically, we all know it. Even fans that are not fans of boxing know the results of this fight. George Foreman beat himself. He punched Ali out so much. He had Ali on the ropes that he tired himself, and Ali came in at the end and he beat him. Rope a dope. you know, and Ali regains the championship. Now, you fully expect that they're going to have a rematch, right? They don't, because abruptly, out of nowhere, due to a near-death experience, George Foreman retires from boxing, gives up boxing in 1977, and he becomes a Christian minister. He converts to Christianity, becomes a minister, and he starts to settle down. And he wants to open up a youth center for kids. But, the 70s become the 80s. Reaganomics creeps in. Uh, you know, a bunch of recessions. The economy's bad, and his preaching, his ministry is not doing so well. But he wants to keep this center open. And there's only two things he knows how to do: be a preacher and be a boxer. So by the late 80s, he starts boxing again, and he's really out of shape. I mean, he was once a beast. He was once a really impressive physical specimen when he fought Ali in '74 in the Rumble in the Jungle. But now he's washed up, you know, you know what I mean. So he has to get himself back in shape, and he does this. And by 1994, to the shock of many, as a middle-aged man in his early 40s, he becomes the oldest man to win the World Heavyweight Championship by defeating Michael Moore. Now, many many people will say, well, of course, the heavyweight division in boxing at that time in the early 1990s was very slim. We talked about it a lot on this channel. What happened was Mike Tyson, who was dominating the heavyweight division in boxing in the late 80s and early 90s, went to jail on sexual assault charges. And boxing didn't have a lot of real stars. Hey, Damien, what's going on? Boxing didn't have a lot of real big stars in the early 90s like that. So it was relatively easy for an older George Foreman to win the title back. But it was a tremendous feat, because when he came back into boxing in like 86, 87, He looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but he got himself back in shape. You know what I mean? And he won the championship, became the oldest heavyweight champion in history at his age. So he does that, and eventually he re-retires again. But this time he doesn't have money problems because he becomes the spokesman for the George Foreman grill, a basically a grill that you can use to make low-fat meals. And he starts to get a bunch of endorsements, not just from the George Foreman grill, but also from Meineke, the car repair group, and he becomes an all new celebrity. People know him more from that than his boxing career. But yeah, he is a legend. He is a legend in the sport of boxing. He was around at the time when heavyweight boxing, when boxing was boxing, the 1970s. Boxing at that time was on regular TV. There was no pay-per-view. We talked about it in the WrestleMania review series that because boxing and wrestling are kind of they have a symbiosis that um, you could see the big fights on as they were happening on closed circuit, but they eventually came on regular TV too. There was no pay-per-view when these guys were boxing, when Ali and Frazier and Foreman were at the top of their game. This was the greatest time in the world, and Ken Norton Sr., the greatest time in the world to be a boxing fan, where you had three of the greatest boxers in the history of the sport, doing their thing. And like David brought up, there is a movie called Big George Foreman that came out about him. It's a really inspiring movie. Um, he and Ali, they always had that animosity, just like he and Frazier, just like Ali and Frazier. And now all three of them are no longer with us. You know what I mean? Rest in peace to George Foreman, Big George Foreman. He made history in boxing twice by being the youngest heavyweight champion at one point and being the oldest heavyweight champion at another point in his career. Uh, Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Damien and David and Lisa, thank you all for contributing. I mean, this is really sad news for the sport of boxing. If only it could be this. If only the heavyweight division could be this good today. You know what I mean? People talk about Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, but they don't compare in either skill nor in box office to Ali, Frazier, and Foreman. Peace. Because you didn't have just one. You didn't have just one. The 1970s for wrestling fans is the equivalent. You want an equivalent in wrestling. The 1970s for boxing was what the Attitude Era was for wrestling, where you didn't just have one big draw, you had many big draws. In the 80s and 90s, you had Mike Tyson, but that was just one guy. You know, in the 70s, you had so many big draws for boxing, so many big draws for heavyweight boxing. So it was similar in the 90s for boxing for the lower weight divisions, like when you had Tito Trinidad and Julio Cesar Chavez and Hector Camacho. But for heavyweight boxing, this was the era, Foreman's era. Peace.